Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Gray Zone. It's me, Max Blumenthal, here with my colleague and co host, Aaron Mate. And we've got a special guest today who I think needs no introduction. And we're just going live as well on Rockfin. So everyone can watch this at rockfin.com at Max Blumenthal. We've got Matt Taibbi with us, journalist Matt Taibbi. That's pretty much all the introduction I need, and matttaibbi.substack.com. Welcome, Matt. How are you
Oh,
doing?
thanks for having me, Max. Aaron, good to see you again.
Good to see you too.
Well, Matt, you've been in the news a lot. I saw the British tabloid The Sun, I guess it's a Murdoch tabloid, had an article, "Who is Matt Taibbi?"
Really?
Yeah, I think it was published in the last 48 hours. So soon you're going to have paparazzi. You might already have that, but I mean, this is, what you've been doing is huge. I'm sorry much of the left has ignored it. I don't know why, but we're definitely paying close attention to it at the Gray Zone. The Twitter files you've been covering, I think, have vindicated a lot of things that Aaron and I have been saying and revealed some new details that are explosive and hilarious.
Yeah, it's hard to say which is which is more, right? I mean, sometimes you don't know whether to laugh or be horrified, but or both. But I would say, like, the first thing for me was that it was just very psychologically helpful, because I thought I was crazy for all these years, and the first time I started seeing these files, in print, saying all these things that I think we all suspected, it was really a relief.
Yeah. Well, before we get into that and into the specifics, including the latest thread, which me and Aaron just find hilarious. I guess I wanted to ask you about the process by which you got these files and how you go about collating them and determining, first of all, what to ask for, what to look for, and what to report.
So without talking out of school too much about some of the arrangements that I might have had, in terms of like attribution and that sort of thing, I didn't go to them. I was approached, by Twitter, and I was the first person, and basically the original idea was just to open up everything that was at Twitter. The original story was going to be about the release of the blocking of the Hunter Biden story. Now, here's where I should talk about. I guess my thought going into this whole process was, wouldn't it be fascinating to find out what kind of a relationship companies like Twitter might have with, the federal government, if they are told by the White House to or by the FBI to lay off stories. It would be great if we could learn that. And so yeah. I picked the Hunter Biden story, thinking that that's where we might see it, if it existed. It turned out it wasn't in that first batch, and that was maybe because, as we subsequently found out, that batch was being reviewed by the Deputy General Counsel and former FBI General Counsel Jim Baker, plus an outside law firm. And once those folks exited the scene, then we had a new regime that involved basically there were some other reporters involved by then, and we would send out requests to an offsite attorney in the company, and then they would turn over those requests fairly quickly. So we can't say with absolute certainty what we're getting, what we're not getting. But what I would say is, my instinct is that they're turning this stuff over so fast that they couldn't possibly be collating it that much or that intently.
Okay. Aaron, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, and just quickly on that, like these would be the way we would do it would be like a very broad search request. We would identify 4 or 5 executives we thought were important executives, and then we would ask for search terms like Russia or Julian Assange, things like that, right? Like
Yeah.
we would see what would come up, and then sometimes if something came up, we would ask to follow up on that.
And was anything off limits? And also, people in the chat are a number of commenters are asking if there's a way to release the source material the way WikiLeaks did.
That's been discussed. I'm sure that's a possible ending to this whole thing. I think the concern from the company's point of view is that they still inherit the liability of the old company. So the lawyers in this situation, I don't feel for them. They're in a very difficult spot because they've essentially been instructed to do everything that they've spent their whole lives being told not to do, like, give important damning documents to journalists willy-nilly. And so that's possible, but I think that decision is a little bit above my pay grade, I think.
Right. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So let's get into some of the latest threads, Matt, which have to do with Russiagate. And just to catch people up on the story so far, because Max and I covered this last week on our Gray Zone live stream of what's been revealed. The short story is basically the Twitter files reveal a lot of pressure on Twitter from Democratic Party operatives and U.S. intelligence officials to basically validate Russiagate, to come up with material that can justify the claims that Democrats and intelligence officials have been making that Russia is waging the sweeping social media influence operation. And the theme that comes back again and again and again is Twitter tries very, very hard to find something, to find these Russian bots, to find Russian actors being responsible for misinformation and for viral claims, but they just can't find anything. And that is very frustrating to the Democratic operatives and the intelligence officials that are putting pressure on them. So one of the latest threads you have is about this hashtag release the memo. And that had to do with basically back in 2018, you have some oversight being done by the House Intelligence Committee under the leadership of Devin Nunes. And they wrote a memo detailing serious abuses by the FBI in their surveillance warrant applications on Carter Page, who was a Trump campaign volunteer. And Nunes and Kash Patel, who was working for him, basically discovered that the FBI was lying to the FISA court. It was hiding the fact that the Steele dossier was funded by the Clinton campaign, even though it was citing the Steele dossier as its main source for wiretaps of a Trump campaign volunteer, Carter Page. It also was lying about the fact that it hadn't corroborated any of the information in the Steele dossier. And so Nunes wrote a very critical memo about that. And for that, he was pilloried by Democrats and the media. And there was a hashtag called Release the Memo, which is basically encouraging the release of the Nunes memo. And at the time, you had something called the Hamilton 68 dashboard, which Max wrote about. And Max, you can say more about this in a second. Basically saying that this Release the Memo hashtag and this criticism of the Steele dossier, that all this was really the work of these nefarious Russian actors. So you have now new information about how Twitter went and looked for some information to substantiate this and came up empty. So talk to us about what happened here. And if I've missed anything or got anything wrong, please feel free to correct me.
No, that's pretty much exactly right. And I think the really damning thing about this is that, Twitter, for the most part, this was 2018, so they were already used to this cycle of being asked to verify claims of foreign interference. But in this case, it wasn't even like, well, we only found a few. It was literally, we didn't find any. And there was there's an incredible quote in there, and if you give me a moment, I can find it. This is Yoel Roth, who is the head of trust and safety at Twitter, and basically kind of the chief censor, who had emerged as kind of a villain in this story because he was very aggressive in censoring a lot of conservative material. But here he looks at the stuff And he says, I just reviewed the accounts that posted the first 50 tweets with the hashtag release the memo, and none of them show any signs of affiliation to Russia. And he talks about how I think we can push back very strongly on this. There's just one email after the other where they talk about how they're not only are they not finding much, they're not finding anything. And they tell this to the staffers. They tell this to Dianne Feinstein's staff. They tell this to Richard Blumenthal's staff. They tell this to Adam Schiff's staff, and it doesn't have any effect. They just go ahead and run with this. They publish public letters about Russian influence. And then there's just an army of private media organizations, none of whom responded to requests for comment, by the way, which is kind of amazing.
Including your former employer.
Including my former employer. And you know, this was a story that only ever had one source. The source did not reveal the methodology, and everybody went with it. And it spread beyond release the memo. I mean, I think as we all remember, it went on to things like Parkland shooting, gun control now. I mean, you know, they were blaming Russians for boosting all kinds of hashtags, and it was all based on this same ridiculous methodology.
Yeah, and here we have tweet by you. As a result, reporters from the AP to Politico to NBC to Rolling Stone were used to write a column, did a podcast with Katie Halper, continue to hammer the Russian bots theme despite a total lack of evidence. And then you can see here, release the memos. Now the top trending hashtag among Russian bots and trolls on Twitter and other platforms, according to the German Marshall Fund's Hamilton 68 website, which tracks Russian influence.
If I'm not mistaken, that's NBC and Ken Delaney, and so you know you can draw your own conclusions there.
Well, for those who don't know, Ken Delaney is the NBC employee who was caught sending his stories to the CIA for approval before he published them. That's who Ken Delaney is. But Max, why don't you tell us about Hamilton 68, this dashboard that NBC was relying on to parrot this claim that all of this was just the work of Russia, because you've done a lot of work on this.
Yeah. I mean, this was my hobby horse back in 2017, 2018, because whatever happened in 2016, this was so obviously absurd that Russian bots.
By the way, right? Wasn't it so obvious?
It was so obviously fake. And this organization comes out of nowhere, the Alliance for Securing Democracy, which hosts the Hamilton 68. And it's said to be the German Marshall Fund's initiative. The German Marshall Fund, first of all, is this organization that has offices in Washington and Germany. And its job is to basically encourage Germany to be a bigger stooge of the US and to be more warlike, but not in support of goals that, you know, World War II goals, but more like post-war goals. So that's what they are. But there were other organizations that came in and funded ASD, the Alliance for Securing Democracy, USAID, which is a CIA cutout. You had Omidyar funding it. You had Sheryl Sandberg's organization. She's also very close to the Democrats. And you had all of these EU foreign ministries sponsoring it. So it was obviously an intelligence front connected to the Democrats, kind of like a regime intelligence front. And they created this dashboard called Hamilton 68. And they brought in these researchers who were a collection of complete cranks. One of whom I wrote a piece about in 2017, Clint Watts, after he testified before Congress that a Sputnik article had convinced people in Turkey to attack the U.S. Incirlik Air Base. It was a completely fake testimony. His whole testimony was a collection of lies, including some that were later discredited in a court case, a libel case. Don't want to go too much into the details, except to say Clint Watts is a giant fraud. His background is suspicious. And he was working with other people like Andrew Weisbird, who most people might not have heard of, but he is a veteran online harasser. He mostly harassed anti-war elements during the Iraq War. It would destroy their reputations online. And he was recruited to create the model for Hamilton 68 based on his Kremlin Trolls website, which basically took alternative media outlets and would essentially blacklist them and give them a ranking of who is the biggest Kremlin troll. And that seems to also have been the basis or the blueprint for the Proper Not website, which you can talk about. But anyway, all these sick figures and hacks came together to provide all this fake research where they were claiming that hashtags on their scientific looking dashboard, hashtags like take a knee, Colin Kaepernick's campaign in the NFL to protest police brutality and the oppression of Black people, were Russian active measure vehicles being pushed by bots online. Then you had people like Nina Jankowicz go out in the media and say the Russian bots are trying to divide us and pit our society against itself so that we are politically destabilized. And the whole media, New York Times especially.
The New York Times, I mean, that's the shocker for me that they went there.
They were feasting on all this Hamilton 68 stuff. And you would even have Senator James Lankford, Republican Uniparty senator from South Carolina. He was featured, quoted in one of the first paragraphs of a front page New York Times story, claiming that take the knee and some hashtag related to the Parkland shooting were Russian active measures, that Russian bots were behind these. But Matt, as you exposed here in this thread, the whole thing was made up. It was completely made up. Yeah,
and Twitter executives had a lot to say about Hamilton 68. There's a lot of internal dialogue about like we need to have a strategy about Hamilton 68. There's a section where one of their senior communications officials talks about Hamilton 68. I'm going to squint here for a moment while I read it off the screen, but
I'm looking for it. It's a long thread.
Essentially, it says Hamilton 68 does not release the accounts that make up their dashboard, so no one can verify the accounts they include are in fact Russian automated accounts. I encourage, and then this is like an off the record guidance to reporters. I encourage you to be skeptical of Hamilton 68 and their take on this, which, as far as I can tell, is the only source on this story. So think about this. They had to have told this to any reporter who called, and there were dozens of print stories about this. And basically,
I was one of those reporters, by the way.
Oh, excellent. What did they tell you?
Emily Horn told me.
Emily Horn. There you go.
Yeah,
that was her quote. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, she told me, well, we think that, this is kind of a gray zone. And I was also asking her why they were offboarding RT and RT's advertising revenue and basically transferring it elsewhere, or like basically stealing it. And so she framed this whole issue of Russian bots and RT as this kind of gray zone where they essentially can't be sure. And so they can't take any risk of being infiltrated by Russia. And then she proceeded to tell me that she was former Obama NSC communications director, which was kind of interesting.
Yeah. She did have that background. And if I'm not mistaken, there were a couple of White House jobs that she had.
But this is amazing. I mean, they knew at Twitter that this whole thing was a fraud. As you can see, she knew it, even though she wouldn't say so to me. But I could sense a sort of nervousness. So basically, Twitter never called this out in public. It would have shut the whole thing down. And then this allowed the senators, the Cold War Democrats, Dianne Feinstein, Richard Blumenthal, I think there were some others, to continue to release these letters and to badger Twitter.
Right. Yeah. And there were other members who kind of piggybacked on the public statements of the first three. Right. It was Blumenthal, Schiff, and Feinstein. But then you had people like Eric Swalwell who would like refer to it. But yeah, internally they were. I think Twitter made a huge mistake. You can see them sort of baldly talking about it, right? This is a comms play by ASD. In other words, this is the Alliance for Securing Democracy trying to get into headlines. Then they say things like, Blumenthal isn't looking for nuanced solutions. He just wants credit for pushing us on this. So they understand the whole thing is a PR ploy by all of these actors, and they could have probably driven a stake through this early if they had given on the record guidance to any of these actors, but they wouldn't do it. And this is a consistent pattern with the company. Often, I think they deferred to outside counsel. Like there were firms that they brought in. They brought in also Burson Marsteller, the crisis management firm. They brought in DeVos and Plimpton, the law firm, and they consistently advised the company to downplay, the sort of skepticism about the Russian interference thing, and instead to act defensive, and to pledge further cooperation with authorities about this stuff. And that ended up being fatal for them, because they ended up just in an endless cycle of answering questions like this.
Yeah. So you highlighted a section. We take seriously any activity that may represent an abuse of our platform. That's kind of their talking point. That's what I got from Emily Horn. And it's just blather. It doesn't mean anything. It essentially means we have to err on the side of caution, and we're being cautious of the state, the senators who are on an intelligence committee that's influenced by the CIA, and of the corporate media that serves as their megaphone.
Right.
And let me just stress again why these actors were so determined to discredit this hashtag, release the memo, and discredit the memo that Devin Nunes wrote. So this is early 2018. And Max, I have a tweet about this at the top of our rundown if you want to pull it up. Sure. This is early 2018. And at this point, Russiagate's in full swing, and Russiagate hasn't really taken any hits yet. The only hit that Russiagate's really taken at that point is that it's a few months earlier, in late 2017, we finally learned, after a year of them lying about it, that the Clinton campaign was funding the Steele dossier. So before that, we've been told that Steele was this intrepid British spy who happened to come across this Trump-Russia plot and tried to warn the country. Late 2017, after the work of Kash Patel and the House Intelligence Committee under Devin Nunes, we learned that actually, the Clinton campaign was secretly paying for it. Okay. And then comes early 2018, this memo written by Kash Patel and Devin Nunes.
The Senate Judiciary Committee had a little bit of a role in that too, but yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So but the point is, Russiagate at that point is pretty unscathed, except for the Steele dossier thing. And then this memo comes along where Devin Nunes looked at the FBI surveillance warrant applications on Carter Page, and they've discovered this relies extensively on the Steele dossier. And there's two main problems with that. One, they're hiding from the FISA court that the Clinton campaign is paying for it. And two, they're hiding that none of this is corroborated, that this is all fiction. And they're misleading the FISA court into thinking that it's been substantiated. So Nunes, Kash Patel write this report, and they're trying to put it out, and they get attacked for it. If you remember this back then, it was a huge scandal where, oh my God, I can't believe they're going after our intelligence community. The FBI puts out a statement saying, if this comes out, this could do grave damage to our national security. Devin Nunes is being mocked on cable news. Finally, it does come out, and like MSNBC and those types have to pretend as if there's nothing damning in it. But look, many years later, the same people who were attacking the memo have to admit that it was right. So Max, click on that photo, and I'll read this quote. This is from David Ignatius. He is basically a close ally of the intelligence community, a columnist for the Washington Post, has a lot of sources inside U.S.
He's the person to put out the Flynn story.
That's right. The Flynn story was leaked, exactly. So when in the early days of Russiagate, in early 2017, yes, he was given highly classified information of a conversation between Flynn, the Russian ambassador, and that led to Flynn being ousted. And of course, the contents of that story, like everything else from Russiagate, were egregiously distorted, as I've talked about elsewhere. But the point is, Ignatius is a close ally of U.S. intelligence officials. But look at what he had to admit many years later. This is in 2020, I believe. He's writing way after the fact. He says, Kash Patel from the House Intelligence Committee sometimes hit pay dirt. He was the main author of a January 2018 House Intelligence Committee report recounting abuses by the FBI in its application for electronic surveillance of former Trump campaign aide Carter Page, though Democrats at the time were reluctant to agree. And that's a very polite way of saying that Democrats were viciously attacking this memo. They weren't
reluctant. A traitor. Yeah,
they were outraged, and they were trying to get it blocked. Facts that emerged later showed serious abuses in the Page investigation. And a former FBI lawyer pleaded guilty last year to falsifying information that was used to apply for warrants from the FISA court. So basically, this is why Dianne Feinstein and Adam Schiff wanted to suppress not only the release of the memo, but even hashtags calling for the release of the memo and trying to attribute it to Russia because it was so damning to their conspiracy theory about Trump and Russia and the FBI's conduct in the process.
And don't forget the moveon.org, right? And there was another organization, I can't
Oh,
remember.
yeah.
They actually started a movement to have Nunes removed from office just just for writing this memo. So that was how insane this
Yeah, here it
this
is.
kind of McCarthyite thing was. I mean, it was completely crazy at the time.
Wow.
We the people
Wow.
demand that Devin Nunes be removed from the House Intelligence Committee. We demand a special prosecutor and an independent investigation. So they have to
For doing
investigate him
oversight. For doing
Yeah,
oversight. Unbelievable. Wow.
Yeah. So I mean, and you're right. This was a crucial moment in the whole thing. Like I think the Russiagate story, which we all, all three of us, I think, we were deeply skeptical of from the beginning and very frustrated about. But there were some key moments. There was the moment in early January 7th of 2017 when there was the quote unquote leak of that Donald Trump had been presented with blackmail material, and this kind of let the P tape story out and a whole bunch of other things and kind of popularized the Steele dossier. Then there was the March 2020 thing where Schiff held hearings where they released news that the FBI was investigating Trump, even though the investigation they didn't. What they didn't tell us is that the investigation was totally cold at that point. Then, as Aaron, as you mentioned, there's the belated, revelation that this was opposition research by the Clinton campaign, which I think should have shut down the whole thing at that point. But then this was key. This early January 2018 moment was a really key moment because it was the first time they really used this technique of kind of blasting somebody with this guilt by association. You're a Russian operative press barrage, and it was really, really effective. So to see what was actually going on underneath at the time should be deeply embarrassing to everybody who was involved in this, but as we know, they're not gonna go near it, but still.
Yeah. One of the most ridiculous. I'm looking for the tweet. It's easy to get lost in all these threads.
I know. I'm sorry about that. Yeah.
One of the most ridiculous stories that came out was that Russian bots pounced after the Parkland shooting. This was in the New York Times. This was a headline. I'll find the tweet in a second. But I guess my question about this is, this is a major New York Times story. It was published by, I think it was like Scott Shane or some other.
It was Shira Frankel.
Oh, Shira Frankel. Okay, I knew her when she was covering Israel Palestine from McClatchy, and she was trying to be a serious reporter. She went to do online and cover the tech world and cyber stuff for BuzzFeed, and then she got promoted to the New York Times. And no one's responding to you. You've reached out to these outlets. Shouldn't she be punished for that story? Shouldn't this be retracted? Shouldn't this be an embarrassment? I mean, this is such an indictment of media culture that they can just get away with publishing stories that are absolutely fake and there's no consequence.
Especially that story, because if you look at it, they didn't just use the Alliance for Securing Democracy as a source. They used New Knowledge as a source.
Oh yeah,
which their own newspaper ended up outing for creating the appearance, the phony appearance of a Russian influence campaign in an Alabama Senate race. Scott Shane.
They did a false flag. They interfered in the Alabama Senate race by putting out bots to boost the opponent. What was his name? Roy Moore.
Yeah, Roy Moore. Yeah, the judge. Race.
Yeah.
So basically, so okay, here we have the New York Times story. It's Shira Frankel and Daisuke Wakabayashi.
Yeah, he didn't answer me either.
And they're citing New Knowledge, and basically
They quote the guy,
Jonathan Morgan,
Jonathan Morgan. Mhm.
chief executive of New Knowledge, a company that tracks. This is pretty typical for them to hop on breaking news like this. The bots focus on anything that's divisive for Americans almost systematically. Okay, this guy should be a notorious character if he had he been working for the Republicans. I don't know. He might have been criminally investigated, because what he and his crew did in Alabama was one of the most devious campaigns I've seen in recent years to create, first of all, the impression that Russian bots supported Roy Moore. They literally bought a bunch of fake Russian bot accounts and then had them push pro Roy Moore hashtags. And then they came out and went to NBC and other outlets and said, Roy Moore is supported by Russia. Here's the proof. And, I think they went on MSNBC and said, Roy Moore is being, but these were all fake bots bought by a Democratic firm. Then they boosted the Facebook page of an unknown lawnmower salesman who was running as a third-party candidate, a right-wing third-party candidate, in order to pull votes away from Judge Roy Moore. And that whole election was so shady. I mean, Roy Moore, I'm definitely no Roy Moore fan. This is the guy
he was the guy who wanted to put the 10 Commandments like in every like courthouse. Yeah, right. Yeah.
I mean, why not put like the 638 commandments, like including like you have to be stoned.
And wasn't alleged
blasphemy.
But also was
in any case,
predator.
Yeah, well, yeah, he liked to hang out around high schools and pick up girls in his like hot rod back in the 60s or so. That was the story. I don't know. I think it was his wife that he met there, but anyway, I mean, that's classic Oppo research, Aaron. That's like stuff we're used to in politics. What they did was so shady. And then remember, Roy Moore was way ahead at the last second. And then all of a sudden, here comes Doug Jones surging ahead in the last second, and Doug Jones wins. The Democrats won a special election. But it was an election in which a Russian active measure, actually a Russian style active measure, was used based
by
on
us.
By us.
Yeah. Unbelievable, right?
Russian
and yeah, and it's unbelievable that happened. B, it's unbelievable that the New York Times did that story, uncovering it, and then didn't go back and clean up their own coverage that had used New Knowledge as a source.
Yeah.
New Knowledge was also involved in compiling reports for Congress, if I remember correctly, and there was some testimony. I have to go back and look at that, but I seem to remember that. But certainly the Times had an obligation at that point to go back and say, okay, we got to re-examine some of these stories. And this one was particularly crazy because they were asserting not only that Release the Memo was a Russian op, but that the Russians were trying to sow division and anything to widen the divide, as the authors put it.
Yeah.
Over the Parkland shooting, gun control now, this is just absurd. I wasn't able to find internal discussions about Parkland shooting, but I did find it about Schumer shutdown, where they're definitively saying there's no Russian anything there. So the company again, they knew that this whole thing was some kind of a political operation. And I'm sure they had to have been telling these news organizations, this isn't right, and yet they ran it anyway, which should tell us a lot about how corrupt this whole thing was.
I actually think going back to the Alabama New Knowledge operation, David Korn was one of the reporters who reported on Russia supporting Judge Roy Moore. I mean, there's another.
Does that surprise you? I mean, Jesus.
Well, the whole premise of his book with Michael Isikoff was the Steele dossier.
Mm-hmm.
What was the book called, Aaron? Collusion, or no? That was
Russian Roulette.
Russian Roulette.
Yeah.
Collusion was Luke Harding's book. He has a new book out about Ukraine after his big success in his interview with you, where he stormed off when you asked him to provide any piece of evidence to support the title of his book, and he couldn't, so he slammed his laptop down.
Still one of
But-
the great all-time moments in internet history, I think. Yeah.
I mean, definitely.
Yeah.
Yes. But David Corn, I mean, he's never, and Isikoff kind of took responsibility.
He did.
He did. Kind
He
of.
did.
Dave,
Kind of, but he at least answered questions about it, which I think was
He
big of
absolutely
him,
did.
you know.
He stands virtually alone in that
Mhm.
group of media professionals who push Russiagate to actually answer critical questions about it. There's no one else who's repeatedly subjected themselves to scrutiny like Isikoff has, to his credit, and has retracted some of it. I mean, for example,
And has admitted some mistakes.
he has.
Yeah.
So what
But
does
look-
it say to you about the? Go ahead.
I'm just saying, like, this is a no-brainer for a news organization. If you have a source that's been blown up in your own pages as lying, you've got to go back and clean up those other stories at minimum. And this one was, this was a really bad story. I mean, if you go back and look at the panoply of influential Russiagate stories that move things along, this New York Times piece really legitimized a lot of this kind of reporting. This, like, oh, there are bots circling around this topic, so therefore, like, Russians want this, right? Which we
Right.
saw over and over again, whether it was the 2020 presidential run of Bernie Sanders or, it didn't matter. We saw that technique happen a lot. That this was a very influential story in the same way that the story from the previous year, the repeated contacts with Russian intelligence story that the Times did. I think that was another big influential story that they never fixed. So,
to explain that one quickly, this is February 2017, early days of Russiagate. The Times puts out a story saying that the U.S. has intercepts of Trump campaign officials having multiple contacts with senior Russian intelligence officials in the lead up to the election. It's an unbelievable story. And 4 months later, James Comey was asked about it, and he had to admit that it was not true. But still,
in the main, it was not true.
It was not true.
Mhm.
And later, a few years later, we actually got a declassified memo from Peter Strzok, the top FBI agent on the Trump-Russia investigation. He actually annotated that. He printed out that Times story and annotated it and said, this is not true. We have no evidence of any of this. Despite all this, the Times has never retracted that story or tried. And in fact, they've even claimed vindication, because when the Senate came out with their report saying that Konstantin Kilimnik is a Russian intelligence officer and Kilimnik is a longtime associate of Paul Manafort, the Times said that this vindicates our story, which, even putting aside the fact that the Senate intelligence report had no evidence for that claim, and that Mueller, who actually had the intelligence on Kilimnik, never made that claim, and the FBI does not call Kilimnik a Russian intelligence officer. Even putting that aside, the Times' initial story was that the Trump campaign was talking to multiple senior Russian intelligence officials. So even if you take on faith the idea that Kilimnik is a spy, for which there's no evidence for, and ample countervailing evidence, even if you take it on faith, the Times story was still not vindicated because it was multiple senior Russian intelligence officials. So that is, I think, honestly, in terms of all the journalistic malpractice in Russiagate, that to me is at the very top.
Yeah, that one stands out. Yeah,
and it built momentum for a special counsel, which happened a few months later.
Absolutely. And again, it was the imprimatur of the Times that, it gave the whole thing heft, right? This wasn't just BuzzFeed talking about it. It wasn't just, Rachel Maddow freelancing on TV. This was the New York Times in a researched front page, investigative feature. And they had a big impact on this stuff, and it's also signaling to people in Congress. They still get the hard copy of the Times every morning, the Times and the Post, and when they see on their desk in the morning that this is what the Times is saying, it tells them, there's going to be a political price to pay if I say something else, and so that was significant. Just like these bot stories, actually, as ridiculous as they're going to seem, to historians 50 years from now, we're gonna look back at them and think they're absolutely absurd. But
we're going to hear Nina Jankowicz singing as we do.
That's gonna haunt me in my nightmares, that video. But no, this meant, I think this meant a lot in the moment, because it told us they could get away with all kinds of stuff, and it also told us that the tech companies knew enough not to squawk publicly, so that that was significant also.
Yeah. Well, let's move on to another hilarious aspect of this whole. One of them, I would say, the most hilarious thread. And is this the one? Yeah, here it is. It relates to Shifty Schiff, Adam Schiff. I mean, this is amazing. Okay, this is the beginning of the thread. Just Adam Schiff ban request. So basically, Adam Schiff's office was behind a lot of this. They were driving the Russiagate related social media censorship campaign and putting in requests for Twitter to ban certain accounts. Which account did they want to ban?
They revealed last week that they wanted to ban the journalist Paul Sperry, who outed the name of the CIA official who was known as the whistleblower in Trump's first impeachment inquiry, who complained about Trump's phone call with Zelensky. So Paul Sperry outed him in Real Clear Investigation. Right. So Schiff wanted him banned, and he also wanted any content on Twitter related to a staffer on his committee. He also wanted that censored because. Yeah, go ahead, man.
Yeah, you can see actually lower in this thread. There's a there's a quote about how far they went in asking for for help with this. Hang on a second, I want to find it because it's just such a crazy
everything
thing.
Is like they'll just say anything is QAnon that they want to ban. This is QAnon related.
Right. Yeah, exactly. They said it was QAnon related, and the logic that they use for that is crazy. But they asked for, among other things, like the complete suppression of any and all search results about Mr. Misko, who is one of the staffers for Schiff, and other committee staffers. So they wanted that. So this tells me that they knew a lot about how Twitter's visibility filtering programs work, because they can do that. They can suppress search results.
Yeah, and Twitter obeyed and said we are de-amplifying these accounts, which I'm de-amplified. I'm sure of it. If I were amplified, it's like every time John Brennan farts and coughs, he gets 80,000 likes. He's like,
exactly.
Donald Trump leads it. His first tweet was like, Donald Trump is the leader of a kakistocracy, and it got like 7 million likes or something. He'd never tweeted before.
And now, what is the significance of this guy Misko? Like, why would Adam Schiff want to have search results about him suppressed?
Well, Paul Sperry, he allegedly had the relationship with Eric Ciaramella, who was the quote unquote whistleblower in the Ukraine affair, and there were multiple tweets that came out that were basically Sperry reporting, but the Schiff's office wanted anything to do with Ciaramella and or Misko's background. Look, there's reporting that Misko has a CIA background. I haven't confirmed that myself, but that's in some of these tweets. So they were mad about that, but they were also mad about things like, you see there's a tweet there.
Well, that's what I wanted to bring up. I wanted to bring up this.
Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to bring up this one because this is the most hilarious aspect. So Adam Schiff basically wanted to have Twitter take down tweets by a Pete Douche parody photo of Joe Biden.
Oh, okay. This is like I know.
It's a funny account, Nate's Liver commentary. I follow this account. And yeah, this somehow upset Adam Schiff so much, this photo and this tweet.
And it's really, actually animated. If you look for if you enter the tweet, the tongue kind of moves around a little bit, and it's even funnier.
I
Which
mean,
is
it
why
really-
the people of California elected Adam Schiff to spend his time taking down tweets like this. This is
right.
a really top issue for voters. Yes.
Yeah, this
Yeah.
is taxpayer resources going to. This was on. They were doing this during office hours.
Yeah.
This is hilarious. I mean, okay,
No,
here's the request.
Yeah.
DNC
And-
reached out to Morning about a different tweet and the same image, but different.
Yeah.
But
So
different textual context, and it's like CC'd to all of these executives. This is
yeah, no, it's
top
like
shit
every senior lawyer in the company had to deal with this. And like a lot of people have been critical of the Twitter files in this project because they think that we're quote unquote cherry picking or showing only one side of things. Just to give you an example of how this worked, like I ran searches for Yoel Roth, the lawyer Stasha Cardile, who it turns out I think it feels like she was running the company. Like everybody seems to be deferring to her, even lawyers technically ahead of her. There was a policy director named Lauren Culbertson. So I picked all the senior officials, and then I ran a search for DNC and RNC, right? On the off chance that there were also requests coming in from the RNC to get rid of stupid pages. And it didn't turn up that. Like what you get from the DNC is just this pile of requests to get rid of mostly really stupid things, like, you know, people saying hey, Republicans, go out and vote on Wednesday or whatever it is, right?
yeah.
But you know, occasionally it's something like this where it's legitimately a parody, and they have to take their time out and explain to the DNC that, you know, we don't do that. You know, this is like speech, and they're not understanding that. On the RNC side, I'm not seeing it. Instead, what you see from the RNC are these constant letters saying, we're going to sue you if you keep doing this kind of stuff to us. So in other words, whether it's because the Republicans didn't think they would get away with it if they wrote to Twitter, or whether it's because there was a genuine difference in how they viewed this kind of thing, there just wasn't, you know, a flip side to the story where you're seeing similarly stupid stuff coming from the Republican side.
Well, the Republicans can't call on their buddies inside
Right.
the building, like Emily Horn or whoever who used to work for for Obama. Like, so what other option do they have?
Or Jim Baker, right? Yeah, exactly.
Jim Baker is the perfect example. And just really quickly, I mean, you found was it you who found the tweet or the file demonstrating that Jim Baker was presiding over censorship and suppression requests from inside Twitter HQ?
You mean about the Twitter files?
Yeah.
No, that was Barry actually who found that out.
Okay.
So she was in the office, and some employee, she asked about, she had made a request about something, and she asked somebody in the office, hey, what's up with that request? And the employee said, it's coming. I just got to ask Jim. And she's like, Jim who? And Barry did a good job. She beat it out of this employee, like, you know, a phone number. She calls the phone number, and the voice on the other end of the line finally admits that his name is Jim Baker. And this is how we discovered that Jim Baker was in the middle of you know, reviewing this material. Subsequently, they accidentally sent us some other things that gave me a little bit more of a window. Like there was an outside law firm that was brought in addition to Jim Baker. So that had a whole protocol for looking at this. And, but there was kind of a bloodbath after that was all found out. Let's put it.
And just for those who don't know, Jim Baker is not the televangelist. Who is Jim Baker? Why is he significant?
He was a former senior FBI official, a lawyer who was
general counsel
to Russiagate. Yeah, he helped push Russiagate. He helped oversee it, and he helped spread around, for example, in the FBI, that fake claim concocted by people working with the Clinton campaign that Trump and Russia were secretly communicating through a bank server, the Alpha Bank server. He played a key role in that. And then, as the Twitter files revealed, he played a key role in recommending that Twitter block reporting on the Hunter Biden laptop story on the grounds that it could be a Russian operation, which Matt exposed, and I think is his first Twitter files thread.
Yeah, he's in there basically saying, you know, we have to exercise caution, which in the bizarre upside down world of this this content moderation world really meant we have to clamp down on a legitimate news story, and cause ourselves all kinds of PR problems. That was what he meant by exercising caution. So
he had no problem sharing with his FBI colleagues a concocted story that Trump and Russia were communicating through the Alpha Bank server. He didn't promote any caution then, but finally, when it came to factual reporting on Hunter Biden's laptop, let's exert some caution and ban it.
He also testified that he was friends with David Korn, and
Yes.
let's not remember. So
That's right.
that David Korn was the reporter who did the second major story about the Steele dossier, a veteran spy. I forget what the rest of the headline was, but it was essentially that Russia had the ability to blackmail Trump.
Yeah.
That came out on October 31st of 2016. So, make of that what you will. The Michael Iskop did the first story in September, and
Korn also passed a copy of the Steele dossier to the FBI. Yeah. And I don't remember who it was, but it may be possible it was Jim Baker who he gave it to. I don't know. But the point is, Korn was so concerned about the contents of the Steele dossier and what they meant about a Manchurian candidate compromised by Russia that he shared it with the FBI. Yeah,
something about that timeline doesn't quite scan with me, because it feels like it could have been going the other direction. But either way, like something's up there,
Yeah.
And so he landed on his feet quite quickly, despite being under investigation for leaking at the FBI. There's actually a humorous sequence that I took out of another thread where they had these industry calls with the DHS and the FBI and some other services, and you had to have a security clearance in order to be there. And they're asking Baker where his is, and he's like, "Oh, of course I got one," because I was, the senior lawyer at the FBI. But actually, he didn't have one because he was under investigation, and he kind of pulls this whole like, "Oh, somebody must have like lost it." There's I'll publish it eventually. It seemed like it would have been distracting at the time, but he was basically trying to hide from his new employees that he had a security clearance revoked.
Wow.
Which is pretty funny.
Well, we're here with journalist Matt Taibbi discussing his reporting on the Twitter files. Max Blumenthal here with my colleague, co-host Aaron Mate at the Gray Zone. And thanks everybody for all your support and for hitting the like button to help us cheat the YouTube/Google algorithm, because there have not yet been the Google YouTube files. We need to see that. We need to see the Wikipedia files. Wikipedia, as one commenter pointed out, does not allow any discussion of the Twitter files except mainstream media coverage. And Matt, how is mainstream media covering this? Because I have not seen it reported except by Fox News and then sites to its right. And how is the left, and I don't just mean the left by the Democrats, but the left, like the Jacobin left, that section of the left, how have they received this story also?
There's two basic responses to this. I think the left is mad at me for what they call doing PR for the richest man in the world, and they can't get past that. So I wish they would, because if they thought about it for a second, they would realize that this story is about people who are more powerful than the richest man in the world. The story is about major institutions like, that are going to be here long after Elon Musk departs the scene. It's about the FBI, DHS, CIA, NSA, all these agencies. And
it's about the national security state. These are as significant as any leaks we've seen in the past few years. I think, there are maybe more blockbuster WikiLeaks files. I mean, the Cablegate was incredible. You're looking at the inner workings, how the sausage is made inside the State Department and the diplomatic services around the world. So they're running color revolutions and ops and everything. But here we're seeing how one of the most powerful communication platforms ever created in human history is being influenced by the state. And people are like, well, but we already knew this. That's like what I see with a lot of like whiny player haters on the professional activist left. It's like, we already knew this. Why do we, or that's one. And then the other one is like Matt Taibbi's covering for the richest man in the world.
I mean, and again, look, I think old school reporters, right? Everybody knows that every source you deal with and every story that you do has motives, and that's part of what you're doing when you're reporting. You're kind of like negotiating the best terms that you can get for your readers. And your sources, may not be in sync with you about absolutely everything. In this case, I actually, I find myself thinking that Musk is fairly genuine in what he's trying to do here. And he may even have bought the company specifically to kind of set fire to the press consensus through something like this, which I think is kind of funny.
So the opposite of why Pierre Omidyar bought the Intercept to disappear the Snowden leaks.
Exactly. Yeah. This was like sort of informational arson, which as a journalist, I can't do anything but applaud. I'm sorry, like that's in my nature. But the personal attacks, I think we all know that's going to come when something like this comes out. But it's been a little bit surprising to me that there haven't been more people who are at these organizations who are saying, all right, like we have to like look at this a little bit, let's assign our own people and to find out whether it's actually true that the FBI and the DHS are funneling tens of thousands of moderation requests, not just to Twitter, but maybe to other companies too. Like, they have sources on this stuff. They can ask those companies. And they haven't done that. And that's been a little bit of a disappointment to me. Like, the personal stuff, whatever, but I find that a little bit weird.
Well, on the left,
on
the left, Max mentioned Jacobin. They had a good article by Branko Marcetic saying why the Twitter files are in fact a big deal. So that was one of the rare cases where I saw, a leftist publication actually embrace what you're doing here, Matt. But for the most part, it's been silence or it's been derision. And my favorite reactions came in the Washington Post and the New York Times, the two main establishment newspapers. The Washington Post initially described Matt as conservative journalist Matt Taibbi. That's how they described you. And then they got mocked so much, everyone made fun of them that they did a stealth edit. They took that out without acknowledging the change, which is very cowardly.
And that happened before I even knew about it. Like, I wasn't me complaining about it, but anyway.
Well, on Twitter, all of us were just making fun of it because it was so funny. And and then the New York Times had this line about how your role, Matt, is controversial in media circles. And they explain why. They say it's because you challenged the notion that there was collusion between Trump and Russia. And so that's why somehow they called you a polarizing figure, because you dared challenge the dumbest conspiracy theory of all time. So that's been the establishment media response in the two biggest outlets. Calling you
the Washington Post. Yeah.
The line in the Times is kind of amazing. Their whole thing was that my quote unquote fan base shifted because I was, quote, this is the quote, I was skeptical of claims of collusion between Russia and Mr. Trump's campaign. So, like,
imagine that.
First of all, that turned out to be the right, response. And second of all, I think it's a window into how these people think, because in their mind, because being skeptical of the
Yes.
Trump Russia story benefited or made happy Trump fans, that must mean that politically that's what I wanted to happen. That was my motive. And you were all in the same boat. It had nothing to do with that. It's just like these stories aren't true. We can't report on them. Like I would happily do this story if there was anything to it.
Yeah.
You were doing your job. Skepticism
Right.
is required of a journalist, because otherwise you're just accepting official narratives on faith, which if that's the case, you might as well go work for the FBI or whatever political
Or
party.
Burson Marsteller or whatever,
Yeah,
right?
sure. Yeah.
Yeah. If you want to make money doing it, right.
Sure.
Well, the reason that this all triggered me so much was that it was obviously part of a broader campaign that transcended U.S. partisan politics to grease the skids for the Ukraine proxy war. I mean, there was the Russiagate was generated by a convergence of Clintonite dead enders and Cold Warrior neocons and actual spooks like John Brennan. And some of them wanted to explain the way the 2016 loss or delegitimize Donald Trump. They were, election deniers, but in a good way. And then you had the spooks who have been trying to gin up a new Cold War with Russia and eventually confront Russia militarily. And that's where we're at right now. And so much of the public was turned hostile to Russia during this period after the kind of ice breaking of the 1990s. And Putin has been turned into the world's greatest enemy. Now he's responsible for trying to pit our society against itself through the Parkland shooting and Take a Knee. And, he's capturing all of our social movements and using them. So that's why this was so dangerous. That's why I was really triggered by it. That's why I think Aaron was, and you as well. It's not just about, scrutinizing an obvious lie. It's about trying to stop a war.
Well, it's been massively consequential. Russiagate poisoned diplomacy with Russia. It set the stage for the proxy war in Ukraine, which was going on long before Russia invaded, to escalate. Trump was pressured to send weapons to Ukraine that Obama wouldn't send. And then when he briefly froze those weapons, he was impeached. And that was portrayed as a grave threat to national security, which solidified the consensus that we need to arm Ukraine and keep this war going. As Adam Schiff said, we aid Ukraine so that we can fight Russia over there and don't have to fight them here, which is a great line.
It's a great callback from the Bush years. But anyway,
Exactly.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. And by the way, Eric Cimarella, the CIA staffer who Adam Schiff tried to protect on Twitter, he served under the Obama administration and was very active in Biden's role in Ukraine after the 2014 coup. Very, very, very active. And so I think his role in Trump's impeachment in which Trump was impeached after he briefly froze those weapons to Ukraine, I personally think you have to wonder whether he was motivated by a desire to keep the Ukraine proxy war going and to undermine Trump's decision to freeze those weapons, which it was alleged he did it to pressure Zelensky to investigate Biden, even though, as I wrote about, when you looked at the details, there was never actually any evidence for that. John Bolton in his memoir says that Trump really just wanted NATO states to pay more for the weapons to Ukraine and not the U.S. Anyway, the point is there's a huge tie here, as Max is saying, between all this and the Ukraine proxy war and what we're having, this disaster we're having now.
Yeah, and it's funny because the one of the first sort of aha moments for me was when Schiff read the Steele dossier into the congressional record in those hearings, and one of the things that he talked about was this idea that that Trump had been given intelligence on Hillary Clinton in exchange for policies that de-emphasized Russia's invasion of Ukraine and shifted the focus to the burden of NATO countries to pay their bills.
Yeah.
And so, he reads this out into the congressional record, and as we used to be, for fact-checking purposes, if something had been read into the congressional record, we used to call that a fact for magazines. So that, because we assumed that had been verified. But when I called up Schiff's office and asked them, what's up with that? Did you guys check any of this stuff? Because there were some crazy claims. They're like, no, we're, I think I told you this, Aaron. Like we look forward to talking with Mr. Steele. So on live television, all of America is watching them making these outrageous accusations that they hadn't even picked up the phone about. Which tells you, I mean, that's a huge red flag that something really serious is up if they're going there.
And it's really important because it actually shows not only the horrible evidentiary standards of those who push Russiagate, but also, again, the direct line between Russiagate and the war in Ukraine now, because this was one of the first controversies of Russiagate, and this is in the summer of 2016. So you have a Republican National Convention, and there's someone there who proposes some language.
An old lady.
An old lady, like an elderly lady who proposed some language that wants to basically make the language about arming Ukraine more hawkish. Like the platform already, by the way, the platform doesn't mean anything. It's all meaningless. Like whatever the platform text says, it doesn't matter. But this happens at every convention. And so this delegate proposes some more hawkish language, saying that instead of saying we need to send appropriate assistance to Ukraine to defend itself against Russia, she wants some stronger language about arming Ukraine. And then some other Republican delegates object to that. And somehow this becomes this major controversy. Josh Rogan, the neoconservative columnist at the Washington Post, writes a column about this. And then shortly after that, the Steele dossier has this entry where it says that, as Matt said, that according to Steele's sources, Trump has been promised intelligence on Hillary Clinton and dirt on Hillary Clinton if he agrees to change U.S. policy toward Ukraine. And that became one of the early talking points of Russiagate. And it turns out that was just based on...
And it was everywhere. Remember, it was like in every news story in the world, right? Yeah.
It was huge. And just to show you what a fraud this was, so the idea that the Trump campaign watered down the Republican National Committee platform to appease Russia and to undermine Ukraine. If you compare the final text of the platforms that summer from the Republican text and the Democratic Party convention text on the same issue of arming Ukraine, the Republican text is still more hawkish than the Democratic Party one. But that just got ignored because that was used to help promote this idea that Trump was beholden to Russia and they were undermining Ukraine. And that set the stage for this climate in which, to oppose Trump, you have to support a neoconservative policy on arming Ukraine. And it helped lead to the climate where diplomacy wasn't possible. Peace in Ukraine was not something to promote. And here we are today. So there's a huge tie between that climate and the war right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And that news story was one of the first that that was blown up, right? Because Mueller talked about how investigated it and couldn't find it. I mean,
of course.
Byron York actually did the first story where he called up everybody involved. And he got some great quotes from everybody saying, no, this was a normal process. There was a moment when a Trump staffer entered the room. I think it was the second vote, but the measure was going to fail anyway. I think that was the upshot of the whole thing. I ended up talking to the same people that Byron did, and this was a fake news story. It was repeated everywhere, which was just a shock to me. I mean, I guess I should be embarrassed that I was already like deep into my 40s and didn't know that this kind of thing was possible. But it was really bad, like the sheer quantity of people who were reporting.
It also shows the feedback loop here, because the FBI then used media reports about this as a basis for their investigation. So they looked into this, and later on there was an article about how the FBI opened up a second probe of Trump as being a Russian asset. This was authorized by Andrew McCabe after Trump took office. So there was the initial Trump-Russia investigation in July 2016. In the spring of 2017, with Trump in office, McCabe authorizes a new investigation of Trump as being like an agent of Russia, not just a conspirator of Russia. So you have two actually Trump-Russia collusion probes. And one of the things that McCabe based this on was media reports about the Ukraine platform change, which puzzled officials.
Came from, right, yeah.
Which came from Democratic operatives and Steele.
Exactly.
So it's like, so it shows like the evidentiary standards were so weak that a media report was enough to get the FBI to open up an investigation of the sitting president as being a Russian agent. I mean, this is just, it's insanity. It's absolute insanity.
and not to date myself too much in this, but I think we all remember, how this same thing happened with the WMD episode, where they fed the Bush Cheney administration fed Judy Miller and Michael Gordon a story about centrifuges that Iraq had bought, and how they could be used to develop a nuclear weapon. And then the day after that story appeared in the Times, Dick Cheney goes on Meet the Press and says, "Oh, did you see the New York Times story?" And so it was, it's the same kind of sort of high school prank, technology that they were using, where they were generating a news story based on, this game of telephone, where there's no actual evidence anywhere in it. It's just a whole bunch of it's just the same story traveling to a bunch of different places. And they did that over and over again with Russiagate and with the sort of Russian bots, Russian infiltration of Twitter and Facebook and that sort of thing. And they learned that that was an effective tool, I think.
Well, definitely. And this wasn't just limited to Russia related to Russian bots or the whole issue of Russiagate. It relates to the U.S. hegemony. We had a commenter just now raise the issue of whether Twitter took measures under U.S. state pressure to censor accounts on behalf of the TPLF, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front. And that might seem like an obscure question, but within the Ethiopian and Eritrean diaspora, that is a major issue, because there was an important hashtag "No More" started by a
I'm gonna write that down.
Ethiopian activist, Simon Tesfamariam. I'll give you all this.
Okay.
He's a real guy. He's contributed to the Gray Zone, and this hashtag coincided with major marches in Washington. Thousands and thousands of Ethiopians protesting U.S. support for the TPLF, which was waging this war and seeking to storm the capital of Addis Ababa. And a lot of it had to do with Ethiopia taking a more independent position in terms of its own foreign policy. But Simon Tesfamariam is still, as far as I know, banned from Twitter. But I see, Matt, you're taking notes on that. There are so many issues, and this relates to two other questions I have that I think are really important to get out. Now, first of them, this is something that I forwarded this to Li Fang, who also has been reporting on the Twitter files. But this is, you can see the label on my report. So basically, anyone who tweets my link, the link to my report, exposing other leaks we got, files we got, showing that the British Foreign Office was actually using Reuters through its charitable foundation, BBC through its charitable foundation, and Bellingcat, which we talk about here a lot, the US and UK funded fake open source intelligence site.
Yeah, the fake WikiLeaks. Yeah,
the fake anti-WikiLeaks, using them as a information weapon and to conduct training seminars in order to weaken Russia. That was actually the explicit language, weaken Russia. So this is an important report on the Operation Mockingbird activities of the largest media two of the largest media organizations on the planet, and Bellingcat. And you cannot, Twitter came up with this label for my report. These materials may have been obtained through hacking. I don't know that they were obtained through hacking, and neither does Twitter. Nobody knows.
So this is like an outgrowth of the Hunter Biden thing, where they used hacked materials even though they weren't hacked. I guess they just created a new policy for especially for you. So you should be proud.
I was very proud, and the piece went viral because gamers started picking up on that label, and they would tweet like a GIF of Alvin and the Chipmunks having sex, and then next to my link, and then it would say these materials may have been obtained through hacking. So for them, it was just like a source of endless hilarity. Our site was briefly shut down because we were getting so much traffic thanks to the fun everyone was having with that label. But
that's great. Think
of how many stories The Intercept has run in recent days, which are obvious CIA hack and dumps on Russia. One of them was hilarious. It was like a Russian network considered quoting Max Blumenthal, but decided not to. Like the ultimate gotcha.
Oh my God.
But those stories don't have the labels. This label specifically for my story and no other story. So I wonder if it would be possible to go to Twitter HQ and put in a request to find out what actually happened behind the scenes there. Who put in this demand for that label and why?
That's interesting. Let me take a screenshot of that because I had never heard of that label before, because they did give us kind of a list of things that they do use, like labels they do apply, and that wasn't one of them. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
But yeah, we might be able to find that out. I mean, it's a cumbersome process, but it would be interesting to know, for sure. And we also don't, to be perfectly honest about this, we don't know how much some of these relationships with the FBI, the DHS, the DOD, like, have they been severed? I don't think so. Like, we don't know.
No, and that relates to another question that I think a lot of people have in the chat, going back to your comments on Elon Musk being some kind of media arsonist and just taking delight in upsetting the hegemonic media elite. But he's also a defense contractor who relies heavily,
of course,
on state. So where do his interests come into play here? I mean, he specifically said that the FBI can play a positive role on Twitter. Might not be getting the quote exactly right. Jimmy Dore did an entire segment torching him for that. So what I don't know if you've had any meetings with Elon or gotten a sense of him, but is there any insight you can offer us here on this issue?
So I've only personally met him a few times, and he's a difficult person to read. I would say my impression of him was generally positive. Maybe that's because I was being invited to do this project, so I was really excited. But I've been focused very heavily on this whole issue of the relationship to the FBI and to the other sort of agencies, and I thought we were making a lot of headway, and sometimes some of those things haven't aroused the excitement that I would have thought they would have. But you don't know.
What do you mean by that? It haven't aroused the excitement you thought that?
Well, I might have thought he would have been like, wow, that's all. I mean, he sometimes he is like that, right? Like, I mean, I can't talk about a lot of this because these are all off the record conversations. But he's got a lot of stuff going on. Like, the company's losing bucket loads of money, and there's dynamics that I don't understand going on. Like, I know for sure, because I've been told by other people in the company, that our presence there is deeply resented and is considered like, potentially, destructive to the entire venture. And so there are people who are worried about their jobs and are looking at us like, we're our presence there is a mere presence there is an insult. So is that working on his mind too? Right? Like, I don't know. It's hard. It's really hard to say. Obviously, you're right. He is a defense contractor. And we are finding things that probably wouldn't be popular with people who would be inclined to give out defense contracts. So we'll find out when he turns the faucet off. We'll find out. But so far,
has anyone been stopped from reporting anything to your knowledge?
No, not to my knowledge. I haven't been. So
okay, and how are you invited, and how is everyone invited? I mean, I find it kind of ironic that I guess Barry Weiss is playing this role now as an adversarial figure, but she's heavily involved in censoring and attempting to suppress Palestinian academics and Palestine-related activists who want to speak out. She led the campaign against Joseph Mossad at Columbia. She is someone I would have associated with the neoconservative movement, which is now invested deeply in censoring these sorts of opinions. Like, I don't know if she's stepped away. It's not like I've had some conversation with her, but it's ironic. And I don't know if anyone's going to be looking into Twitter banning countless Palestine related accounts.
Well, I would look at it. I mean, I've written about that a lot in the past.
But how was everyone chosen? I mean, I'm not saying you're a conservative journalist, but there does seem to be a certain political through line and a sense of shared sensibility among those who were chosen.
Well, I think the first thing is that none of us are, with the exception, I guess, of Lee, who still technically works at the Intercept. None of us have a connection to traditional corporate media anymore, right? So that's probably the first thing. My guess is that he wanted this to be a burn on traditional corporate press, and I think it has been so. But I don't have any insight into.
I mean, it sounds like he went with people who he trusts, which is how it works. I mean, that's where people get sources from, is if the source trusts them. And I mean, I just come back.
Or if he's a fan of them. I mean,
yeah,
right.
Or if he, I mean, sure. And also, for me, what matters is the material accurate or not, and is it newsworthy? And just, I mean, the Washington Post is owned by a defense contractor, but if the Washington Post had a explosive story, which they have sometimes, and they've exposed war crimes. For example, in Afghanistan, they had a big series recently about U.S. files and how the U.S. covered up the progress of the war in Afghanistan. It's valuable on its merits, and that's just the reality of the media environment that we're in. It's just like we have our overlords; they control our institutions, and the hope is that sometimes some factual information can get out within those constraints. And I think with the Twitter files so far, there's been a lot of great material, as we've talked about today.
Yeah, and he's, certainly this stuff isn't coming out if this guy doesn't buy the company for $44 billion or whatever it is. And I'm sure there's stuff that's come out that hasn't been pleasant for him, right? And he hasn't shut it down yet. So I don't have to be thankful for that. It's not my job to be thankful for that. But it's I think on the whole it's a net plus. Like, as long as the information's coming in, it's a tremendous opportunity, not just for me but for any journalist to look at this information and cross-reference it with other things that have come out, other leaks, other types of investigative reports. And so I think it's been a good thing. And the question of motive, it's funny how people only selectively bring that up to me as far as I'm concerned. Like, sources always have motives, and what's important is what our motives are when we look at the material. And the only ethical question for me is, if I ever get the sense that the stuff I'm being sent is not what it's been represented, then I'm going to have an ethical moment where I'll have to say, I can't do this anymore, or I can't say that this is a representative batch or whatever, right? Like, so that's the test, I think.
Right. And do you have any idea what was going on here?
No, I don't. Although I think I might have even texted him the day after that. He's a busy guy. He's all over the place. But I have no idea what I mean. Like, I was in the middle of putting together the this thing of I think that was the day before Christmas.
Do you think that it was
December 23rd, maybe?
Yeah, World Cup final. So it was I think Yeah, World Cup final might have been December. I think it was on my birthday, December 18th, but I could be getting that
December
wrong.
18th. Okay, so that's a different one. Yeah, but yeah, no, I remember I had been pulling an all-nighter, and then I looked up to see that photo, and I was like, what the fuck? But
I was wondering if Kushner showed him the Zapruder tape the way he showed it to his father-in-law.
yeah, I don't know, but you know,
So you texted him? Did he? What did I mean? Did he say anything about that interaction or what he was doing?
No. I mean, like, he doesn't. I'm not the sharing type. I mean, he got along well with Barry. But he's been very straight with me, and you know, I think it's this whole thing has been, you know, not always pleasant for him, and it's still going. So you know, that's got to be a net positive, I think, for sure.
Will he sell the company? I mean, there have been a lot of rumors about that. Do you have any insight there?
I don't. You know, I think a lot of us who were involved in the project, you know, we did have some discussions early on when we were kind of all in the same room, and we all had the same thought, which was, this thing, no matter what it is, it's probably temporary, right? Because sooner or later something's going to happen. There's going to be a congressional investigation, and one day there's going to be like a whole bunch of lawyers are going to come through that door, and this is all going to be shut down. And so our thought was, let's grab as much as we can from the historical record before we start nosing around the present. And so that's kind of, we're still in kind of that place.
Yeah. Well, Aaron, is there anything else you want to ask Matt before we wrap?
No, I think it's a good place. I think it's a good place to wrap. And Matt, I just want to thank you again for all the work you've done. It looks it's a lot of material to go through. And again, what you confirmed so far, not just on Russiagate, but on the other stories too, is just the outsized role of unaccountable intelligence officials and partisan operatives in influencing what the public is allowed to see and what information they're allowed to access on social media. So that to me is the theme of the Twitter files. And I imagine there's more to come, and we can expect a similar theme.
Yep.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Elon said we'll coup whoever we want. So I mean, maybe he's taking that back home. It's all coming home.
Yeah. No, I mean, I hope that there's more. I think, you know, we do have a lot of stuff that we haven't even gone through yet. So I'm sure that there's going to be more interesting material, but anyway, thanks guys for having me on. I really appreciate it. And, you know, happy to come on anytime.
Great. Well, we'll invite you back. I know you're really busy, but we've been covering this intensely. We're also covering, you know, we'll feature this conversation on the Gray Zones Pacifica show, which is airing at KPFK LA on Tuesday at 5 p.m. and WBAI New York Sundays at 6 p.m. So, you know, if you missed any of it, look for it there. And at my own podcast, which you can find on Anchor FM or Spotify, just search my name. We're also at rockfin.com. Just, I guess the last question, Matt, are you planning to turn any of these files and your reporting on this into a book?
I don't know. Maybe. It depends. Depends on how it kind of ends, but it could be a really interesting book and surreal. So kind of a combination of All the President's Men and Confessions of a Dangerous Mind. Remember that thing about Chuck Barris? There's a little of both of those stories in this. But anyway, I forgot to say thank you to both of you guys for sticking with these topics throughout all these years, you know, before files like this leaked out, because you know, it was a pretty lonely time for a lot of us during all those years. And I probably, I would have, it was really important that you guys stuck with it all that time. And
well, it wasn't just lonely. You got accused of being like a literal Russian spy if you did it. I mean,
right? Yeah, exactly. That was not fun for any of us. So, but you know, I know you guys both took a lot of abuse and kept at it. So,
Well,
thank you for me.
Hey,
For
well, likewise, Matt. And honestly, I have to. Yes, there were some hard times, but I also really enjoyed it too. There was because it was so we're challenging something that's such a transparent scam that it's not as if there were any moments where I was like, oh my God, am I on the wrong side? Am I doing the wrong thing? It was just vindication after vindication and humiliation after humiliation on the other side. So I've really enjoyed it. And it's hilarious.
And now they've all moved on. It's like the
Right.
same guy who did the reporting on the Russian bots is now reporting that Russian bots had no influence.
Exactly. Yeah,
exactly. They'll just recycle it. But anyway, thanks a lot, gentlemen. Really
All right,
appreciate
Matt,
it.
thanks
I'll
for
see you
joining
again.
us.
All right.
All right. Yeah, well, thanks again for being with us for another episode of The Gray Zone. We're going to try to be here every week with more great guests like Matt who are doing real reporting and bringing forward insights that mainstream press won't give you. Aaron, you're a busy man. You're working a lot of jobs these days.
Yeah. Jimmy Dore, I'll be guest hosting today at 4 p.m. Eastern time. So tune in for that. And,
so you can just kind of take a break right now. It's 2:30 Eastern time, and then tune in to
come
Aaron
back for more. Yeah.
And we'll cover like more or less the same topics. I mean, like Matt was thanking us for covering this, but we just have like these monomaniacal personalities. So it's just like inevitable that we're going to do it. And I think that's what journalism is all about, is you take a story and you just stay with it, and you got to be like a pit bull and you just keep digging your teeth in until you hit the jugular vein. Especially if you're in independent or alternative media. And I think, we're finally seeing results there. But the most important thing I think we can do is what Matt did, which is to reach out to these legacy media organizations and demand that they comment and hold them accountable. So,
amen. And that's what we do. And that's what we'll continue to do. So thanks everybody for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.
All right. Peace.
Peace.